The country of the Philippines has boasted a wealth of stunning natural wonders and a myriad of terrifying stories, from vaguely supernatural to downright spine-chilling. In the past, a street in Manila's biggest city, Quezon, has hosted such scary tales. A particular street, Balete Drive, was named after an endemic tree in the region and has been the subject of numerous paranormal reports and investigations. The Balete trees have been thought in many areas of the country to be dwelling places for supernatural beings, such as the Tikbalang, a half-human, half-horse humanoid. In some places, sorcery rituals are known to be performed inside the chambers formed by the tree. Also, among others, some superstitious folks suggest not bringing in Balete as decorative plants inside a house, as they allegedly invite ghosts. In the past, Balete Drive, an undivided 2-lane street and the main thoroughfare of New Manila, was lined with large Balete trees that darkened the area considerably and made it appear frightening to some Manila residents. The following story was recounted to me by an old acquaintance of my father, a fellow cab driver who used to transport people to other parts of the metro. While going through the infamous Balete Drive more times than he could remember. The man's now retired, and he visited my father on an invitation to his 65th birthday. The celebration went as well as anyone could have hoped for. Families and friends that have long been separated apart were reunited. Food and drink were aplenty, and the famous Filipino karaoke blasted through the air. It was 9:30 in the evening when the celebration started slowing down. One by one, guests bade my father farewell, with promises that they'd be there on his next birthday. One of the guests, the old cab driver, had to stay at our place, as it would be too difficult for him to go home that late. The man currently lives in a town in Laguna, a nearby province from Metro Manila, and 100 miles away from our residence in Quezon City. We asked him to stay the night at our home for his own safety and convenience. After a series of overly dramatic convincing from my father, the man relented and decided to stay. I promised him I'd drive him to the bus terminal to Laguna first thing in the morning. It was past 11 when all of the guests, except for some family members and the old man, had left. The celebration, however, did not entirely end, as my father, the old man, and I decided to sit and pour ourselves some more liquor. The two old-timers' conversation mostly circled around their time as fellow cab drivers, working for the same operator. As a 31-year-old working man, it was a pleasure to see both my father and his friend reminisce about their past. As inexperienced as I was at that point in my life, I did little to contribute to the conversation. For the most part, I was there as a listener, a passenger on the two old men's trip down memory lane. The conversation and drinking between all three of us lasted until past midnight. I was about to announce to my old drinking buddies that it was time to call it a night, when suddenly, the old man told me to wait, as he'd like to tell a story he just remembered while reminiscing about his past. My father sat straight up, seemingly taken out of his drunken stupor upon hearing his friend's words. "What? You're going to tell us that story again?" my father, in his drunken state, asked. "Yeah, I know I've told you this many times before, but your son hasn't heard it yet. Besides, what better way to end the night than with a good old scary story, eh?" the man added, accompanied by a chuckle. All right, well, just so you know, my son here is easily spooked. He also drives through that same road," my father jested, aiming to take a jab at my reluctance to listen to scary stories, especially ones about the infamous street that I knew my father was referring to. "Nah, look at your son. He's a grown-up. I'm sure he can take a few scary stories before bedtime. Can you, son?" the old man uttered as his face turned towards me. I nodded in confidence. I didn't know what to expect at that point, but I could tell then and there that it would be an interesting story. The old man fixed himself up, trying to shake off some of the alcohol in his system from a long night of drinking. "All right then, here's my story. A true life experience when I was still young, in the mid-70s, and I was in my mid-30s if I remember correctly, still driving a cab with your father." His face once again turned in my direction. "This was when I encountered something I thought only existed in horror movies or novels. An encounter which, at that time, I seriously thought would be the end of me." He said this with a more somber tone. The old man's name was Rico, and this was his story. It was close to midnight when Rico, driving a cab assigned to him, found himself driving along the desolate stretch of Balete Drive. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows from the towering Balete trees that lined the road. He hated taking this route due to its infamy, not only due to alleged hunting, but mainly due to the street's poor lighting, mostly obscured by the tall Balete trees. The area was known to be accident-prone, and tragedies involving all sorts of motorists are reported almost monthly. His last passenger had insisted it was the quickest way to her destination. A young lady, dressed in a bright red gown, trying to get to a college prom held at a convention centre within the nearby University of the Philippines campus. Rico dropped his passenger off at the main gate and contemplated going back the same way he came, as doing so would allow for the shortest time to exit Balete Drive. Then he remembered the time. It was 15 past 10, and he was supposed to be at home by 11. While his working hours typically lasted until the wee hours, he wanted to get home early and get to bed for the rest of the night. He needed to wake up early the following morning, as he had to drive someone to an international airport. This basically means that going back to the portion of the street where he entered would require him to take a longer route back home. The alternative was to take the rest of Balete Drive, exiting at a main highway leading up to his residence in Caloocan. While very unappealing, this option would cut his travel time by about half an hour. After much contemplation, Rico decided to continue traversing Balete Drive. "If I just focus my attention on the road and don't think of the stories, I should be able to exit the street in no time," he said to himself, trying to suppress his apprehension. "Besides, those are just stories. Urban legends shared among friends on a drinking binge," he added. And so, Rico went on to take the remaining distance out of Balete Drive. The night was dark, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the road. The only sound was the engine's hum and the occasional rustle of leaves. He glanced at the clock. It was late, and he was still far from home. He turned up the radio, hoping some music would ease his tension, but the signal was weak. Only static filled the air. Rico focused on the road ahead. Just a few more kilometers, he thought. However, the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly. Each turn brought unexpected bumps and shadows. He tried to keep his mind on the driving, but strange shapes flickered at the edge of his vision. Just my imagination, he muttered to himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something watched him. Every so often, he'd catch a glimpse of movement in the trees. A stray dog, a cat, perhaps some college students that were up to no good. Rico shook his head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. As he turned onto a curve suddenly, his headlights caught something. On the side of the road stood a figure, a woman in a white dress, her hair long and tangled. She looked lost and afraid, and Rico's heart raced. Should I help her? He thought. But the road was dark, and his instincts told him to keep driving. Rico hesitated, but eventually slowed down. A potential passenger this late at night was rare, and fares had been scarce all day. Where to, ma'am? Rico asked, rolling down the window slightly. The woman didn't respond. She simply opened the back door and slid into the seat behind him. Her movements were slow, and Rico couldn't help but notice how cold the air suddenly felt. Balintawak, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rico nodded and began driving, trying to ignore the strange chill creeping up his spine. The road was eerily quiet, save for the hum of his engine. He glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a clearer look at his passenger. Where exactly in Balintawak would you like me to take you, miss? He asked, but she only stared ahead. The road twisted and turned beneath him, and the night seemed to grow darker. His mind raced. Was this a good decision? Should he have driven away? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something alarming in the mirror. Behind them, the shadows seemed to grow larger and darker, and an unshakable feeling of dread washed over him. He pressed the gas pedal, desperate to escape the growing fear. Rico's heart was now racing. A million thoughts ran through his mind. The lady in white still hadn't spoken a word since providing her destination. At this point, he decided to look in the rearview mirror to check on her once again. But what he saw froze him to the core. The woman's face was a blank void. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an empty, pale surface where her features should have been. Panic gripped him. He tried to focus on the road, but the rearview mirror seemed to pull his gaze back. The woman's head was now tilted slightly, as if she was staring directly at him, though she had no eyes to do so. He slammed on the brakes. "Ma'am, please, you need to get out," he shouted, his voice trembling. The woman didn't move. Instead, she leaned forward, and he felt her cold breath against his ear. "Why are you afraid?" she whispered. "You picked me up, didn't you?" The woman's words were accompanied by a chilling mist that penetrated through Rico's body. This was his breaking point. He stopped the cab right in the middle of the road and turned to the woman in the back seat, wanting to tell her to get out of the vehicle right away. But as he turns, the woman vanishes from the car, nowhere to be found. He was at a loss for words. Was he just imagining things? Was there really a woman a few minutes ago inside the vehicle? Am I finally losing it? was Rico's final thought. With the woman no longer inside the vehicle, Rico started the vehicle's engine again and continued to drive down the empty road. His knuckles turned white while he tightly gripped the steering wheel. He glanced at the dashboard and he saw he was clocking in at more than 100 kilometers per hour, twice the speed limit. He couldn't care less at this point. His only thoughts were to get out of the accursed Balete drive as soon as possible. Then, after a few minutes of driving at a dangerous speed, he realized something. Where the hell's the exit? He thought. This road seems to never end. I've driven through this same road during the day, and I don't remember this road being this long. He was muttering to himself in a desperate attempt to make sense of what was happening. He glanced at the clock. Time was passing, yet he hadn't reached the exit. Almost an hour had passed, and he was still driving along Balete Drive. This can't be real, he once again muttered to himself. I'll run out of gas soon. There's no way I'm stopping on this road. I'll stay inside the car and spend the rest of the night if I have to. After more than an hour had passed, he saw what appeared to be light in the distance. A small light flickering through his windshield. Hope surged through him. He sped towards it, hoping he was finally nearing the exit. But as he got closer, the light vanished, leaving only darkness behind. Rico looked around. The trees now seemed to close in on him, and he felt trapped. Please, what the hell's going on? He asked to no one, his voice trembling. He was growing desperate and more terrified at that point. Terrified that he may never be able to reach the exit. Am I dead? Did that woman actually kill me? And now I'm just another ghost driving along this forsaken road on an endless journey to escape. Is this the afterlife? Am I in limbo? A series of thoughts flooded his mind, with each one drawing him closer to a somber but likely conclusion. In Rico's mind, he might as well no longer be in the world of the living, as there was no making sense of the events that had just unfolded. Another half an hour passed, and he was getting tired of the endless driving. He was so tired that he even considered stopping in the middle of the road and accepting his fate. No, I'm not going down without a fight. I still have my hunting knife tucked in under my seat. This was Rico's last flicker of resolve. While trying to find the hunting knife that was gifted to him by a friend in the army. Previously, it had given him the confidence to fight off any potential robbers during his night shift. That same knife was giving him hope to, at the very least, have something to fight whatever malevolent entity had been causing him such torment. A few more minutes had passed, when suddenly, his headlights caught something. He hit the brakes. Now, standing in the middle of the road, was the same woman in a white dress, her hair long and tangled. Rico screamed out loud as he hit the gas and tried to drive around her. Just as he was about to pass, she instantly vanished into thin air. Rico, however, didn't stop driving. He wasn't picking up the same scary lady this time. He continued to drive. The road was now getting even narrower, with a steep drop on one side. He pressed on, his knuckles whiter than ever. The figure appeared again at several more turns, always maintaining the same distance. His hands trembled as he struggled to maintain control of the car. The road was becoming increasingly treacherous, with potholes and loose gravel making driving a challenge. His heart pounded in his chest, and beads of sweat trickled down his temples. He didn't remember the road being this rough, but this didn't matter much to him. In his mind, he might as well have veered off course, ending up in a remote, secluded road that may very well lead to his eventual demise. Rico, however, kept driving. Not a moment had passed when he suddenly felt an all too familiar sensation. The sensation that someone was with him in the vehicle. The atmosphere inside almost instantly turned chilly, accompanied by a subtle but audible breathing in the back seat. "You're here again, aren't you?" Rico remarked, with a now surprisingly braver tone. The events leading up to that point had exhausted him of all of his fears. He somewhat became desensitized to the woman's presence, and he'd long come to an understanding that if this was going to be his end, then so be it. But he intended to fight back, whether it be using his knife or any other means that would at least give him comfort that he went down like a man, fighting. I just want to go to my family," came a chilling voice from the back. Will you take me there, mister?" "Where? To Balentawak," Rico calmly responded, trying to sound as casual as possible. Yes, Balentawak." All right, I can take you there. But you see, you have to pay a fare for me to take you there, you know," he added, while now trying to display his usual self as a taxi driver. There was no response from the woman in the back, however. "You see here, this is what we call a taximeter," he continued speaking, while tapping on the taximeter. Still, there was no response from the passenger. "This thing here clocks in the distance we've travelled and calculates how much it'll cost," he went on, without paying any mind to his passenger's silence. "From my estimate, the total fare from here to Balintawak should cost you around 500 peso. Rico's sentence was cut short by a new development. The woman, who'd been silent the whole time he was talking, all of a sudden grabbed his right hand with a grip so tight that it almost restricted blood flow to the rest of his arm. The woman's unexpected move caused panic in him, shattering his initial facade of calmness and fearlessness. The man frantically tried to shake his right hand to remove the woman's vice-like grip, to no avail. The woman's hand felt ice cold. So cold, it delivered a level of pain to his entire body that he never knew he would get to feel. "Get off of me, you wretch," Rico commanded, while trying to steer the vehicle from going off of the road. The woman, however, did not relent, and finally blared something in Rico's ear. "Take me to Balintawak." The words were so loud that Rico could feel his eardrums shattering as the vehicle's glass windows and windshield vibrated, about to break at any second. He instinctively reached out for the hunting knife, tucked safely underneath the driver's seat with his left hand, momentarily letting go of the steering wheel. He effortlessly unsheathed the knife from its scabbard and, with all of his might, stabbed the woman's hand that was holding his right arm. The knife, however, failed to even penetrate her skin. It would seemingly bounce off of her arm with every stab that he attempted. Rico, seeing that his attacks didn't work on her arm, attempted to stab his attacker in the face. The car at this point had been swerving from left to right, with Rico's remaining free hand alternating between attacking the woman and manning the steering wheel. With the remaining strength he could muster, he took one full swing with the knife at her face. The almost 90-degree left hook landed on its intended target. While he couldn't exactly tell where the tip of the knife landed, he surmised that it was somewhere on the lower left eye of the woman. To his horror, though, even this long-winded attack did no damage to the woman in the back. She didn't budge and continued her vice-like grip on his right arm while wailing the same words as before. At this moment, he realised that the woman isn't simply a ghost. She's a malevolent entity feeding on his fear, slowly draining his life force with every second her cold, bony hand clutches into his. Left with no other choice, he turns to other means he knew could potentially ward off ghosts and evil spirits. Prayer. Up until that point, he'd never considered himself a religious person. Although born and raised as a Roman Catholic, he rarely attended church or mass. However, he spent all 4 of his high school years at a Catholic school. During those years, he learned to memorize common prayers and other religious incantations that surprisingly stayed with him even now. Not being able to make the sign of the cross using his right hand, he did so with his left. This time, he decided to fight the entity not with physical force, but with his will. Anything to repel the malevolent spirit. The struggle became a terrifying battle of wills, a fight for his sanity and his life, as the eyeless woman in white relentlessly tried to pull him into the darkness. The woman, however, is undeterred, and the car becomes a battleground between the driver's unyielding strength and a demon eager to claim its next victim. In a race against time, he doubles down on reciting prayers from his childhood, testing his courage as the woman now seemingly tries to take control of the taxi, steering it towards a ditch in the side of the road. Desperate and determined, he tries to invoke ancient verses that resonate with divine strength. The woman, who now resembles more of a demonic entity, roars in fury, but his unwavering strength begins to weaken its hold. With a final, resounding chant, Rico confronts the demon head-on, channeling all of his hope and courage into one last attempt. And when the tussle between Rico and the now demon-looking woman seemed to never end, a saving grace unexpectedly came. A beam of light from a semi's headlight illuminated the vehicle. This instant illumination momentarily distracted him from his ordeal. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. A truck driven by a live human being. At this point, he didn't even notice that his taxi had ceased to move. He'd somehow managed to hit the brakes amidst the chaos and halted the vehicle to a full stop on his side of the road. Then, in only a matter of a few seconds, his awareness returned to the tribulation at hand. The demon was gone. She'd somehow disappeared when the lights hit the vehicle. Not wanting to let his guard down, and not fully believing his torment was finally over, Rico spun around the vehicle, trying to find any trace of the woman in a white dress. Finally, after what felt like hours of thoroughly checking the vehicle and the surroundings, he leaned back in the driver's seat and exhaled a deep sigh of relief. His heart was still pounding at an exhilarating speed, and the pain in his right arm from the woman's grip still persisted. But he knew that this time he was saved. He took another few minutes to catch his breath before starting the ignition, and with visibly shaking hands, grabbed the steering wheel and continued to drive along Balete Drive. Not long after, a green metal sign perched atop a metal pole had a sign that read, "You're now exiting Balete Drive." He almost broke into tears upon reading the sign. "I made it! I survived!" he exhaled to himself with clenched fists, pounding the steering wheel for a triumphant victory. Rico made it home at 2 a.m. Needless to say, he didn't get any sleep, and ended up picking up his passenger an hour earlier than agreed. The ordeal left a deep mark on Rico's life. He actively avoids Balete Drive during his shift, and if the situation really needs him to, he makes sure to drive along the road during the day. Nowadays, Rico enjoys the retired life with his family in Laguna. "Well, what can you say, kid? Wasn't that a great scary story I just told?" Rico went on to ask, while gently slapping my left arm. "Yeah, it was a cool story. I'm glad you made it out alive," I responded with an audible chuckle, signalling that while I enjoyed it, I was unsure of how true it was. Rico caught on to my sarcasm and showed me his right arm. "Tell me, son, what do you see?" he asked. I looked at him, unsure of what he wanted me to see, but I squinted at his right arm. The old man's skin has turned dull and wrinkled due to his old age, but upon careful inspection, I swear I could see a print, a handprint that, although subtle, had a clear outline of human fingers attached to a palm. "Is that what I think it is?" was all I could say. "Yes, kid, it's exactly what you think it is," he responded. I could only look at the old man with apparent disbelief at that point. Are we done?" Our conversation was interrupted by my father, who'd just woken up from a nap. Unbeknownst to us, my old man fell asleep shortly after Rico started recounting his experience. My father had already heard the same story from his friend more times than he could count, and he surely wouldn't mind not hearing it another time. "Yeah, I think we're done here. I'm already way past my bedtime as it is," he gestured with an audible laugh. The two old men went to bed at around 1 a.m. He'd recounted that story for almost an hour. I stayed awake for a few minutes in order to clean the table where we'd had our little soiree. The next morning, I made good on my promise and drove Rico to the bus station. In tow was my father riding next to me. After telling his scary story, Rico and I had somewhat developed a bond, and he requested to be seated in the passenger seat next to me. Along the way, the old man and my father continued their conversation, reminiscing about the past. He occasionally spills out silly secrets from my father's past life, all in good fun. After 45 minutes of driving, we arrived at the bus station. We finally bade Rico goodbye, and my father and I drove back home shortly after. Every now and then, I remember Rico's story about his encounter, with the woman in white and the long, empty, unending road. I'd contemplate whether to believe the old man's story was true each time. While his story may be just one of the many fabricated tales and creepy stories about Balete Drive, I could also tell that he wasn't lying when he recounted his experience. While ultimately, I can't say I believe his story, on the other hand, I do think that the old man fully believes that his encounter was real. I'd always be reminded of the old man's story every time I happen to drive by the same road. I may not admit it, but as a precaution, I always avoid driving through the road late at night, lest I encounter the woman in white of Balete Drive. For more terrifying creepypasta horror stories, check out the playlist or the video on screen.